anti-nationalist against Finns there, because Finns are a nation, not a race. So in other words, I was taught, Finns suck, Swedes are wonderful. Now, here's the weird thing about Finland svenskar, is there's Swedes from Finland, and the reason there were Swedes in Finland is Sweden conquered Finland, so they were the nobles who went in to rule Finnish land and peasantized the Finns. So they were not good guys. And they ruled over Finland in this really nasty way for centuries, and then in the Napoleonic Wars, Sweden picked the wrong side, and they sided with the French. The French lost, I don't know if you know that. Napoleon was defeated. And so as part of Sweden's punishment, Russia took Finland from it. The Russians then went to the Swedes living in Finland, and they said, hey, you guys know how to control these Finns and rule them. You already have your little fiefdom set up with barons and dukes and counts and stuff. You keep doing that, but in our name, and we'll leave you where you are and you just pay us taxes. And the Finland svenskar went, yeah, that's a good deal. So basically we lost nothing losing to you in the war. And they're like, yeah, sure. That's how you want to feel about it. In other words, the Finland svenskar are not the most popular people in Finland. They're about 6% of the population, and they're, it's an ugly history. I'm owning this. I'm not going to try and sugarcoat or gaslight you. My ancestors were on the wrong side, just so we're clear. Until World War II, and then we made up for it. The Swedes fought side by side with the Finns against the Russians, and all is forgiven. And the Finns and the Swedes are like the Bopsy twins of Europe now. I don't know if you caught this in the news a few months ago, but the Prime Minister of Finland said we want to join NATO, but we can't unless the Swedes join. And it's because Finland will never do anything without Sweden, and Sweden will never do anything without Finland. And Sweden said, we've been holding on to our neutrality for a long time, but if you need to join NATO, and we think you do because the Russians are a real threat, we have to join NATO to support you. Like, that's how their relationship is. They're very cute. They should totally just get married and get it over with. They are. They're already married. So in other words, if I went to Finland, even though there might be some latent resentment left, I'm probably okay. I'm not like scared or anything about it. I took 23andMe. Don't do 23andMe if you're a racist. I'm just telling you right now. It's gonna upend your entire worldview of yourself. It turns out my grandmother was mostly Finnish. It's like, oh no. So now I have to spend years now trying to overcome my anti-Finnishness and embrace the fact that I'm more Finnish than Swedish. But am I? So she had a Swedish name. She spoke Swedish. She identified as Swedish. It's just genetically she was mostly Finnish. See how complicated this got all of a sudden? But now here's the really weird twist, and it's why I'm bringing this up. If you're a 6% minority in a place, and you only want to breed with your own nation, it's going to get cousin-y really fast. You know what I mean? You're probably doing your children and grandchildren a huge disservice. At some point, you're going to want to open up to the possibility of marrying into one of the locals. And that's what my ancestors did. So what I am is I'm paternally Swedish, and I had a Swedish male ancestor who married a Finn, and then maybe he married a Swede, that child married a Swede, but then there were like 2 more Finns, and then a Swede again. In other words, as time went by, we effectively became genetically Finnish, because that Swedish DNA just kept shrinking every time there was a marriage to a local. And that's what happened to Heron. When the Greeks conquered Egypt, 300 years before Heron's birth, the Greeks definitely separated themselves out from the Egyptians because they saw the Egyptians as inferior. But after 15 generations, there was no way Heron wasn't part Egyptian. In other words, calling Heron the Greek scientist from Egypt is really an interesting proposition, because how Greek was he? How Egyptian was he? After 15 generations in Egypt, how Greek were the Greeks? If nothing else, their culture was modified by the Egyptians they lived around. Their DNA was modified because you know they were marrying into them. Not Cleopatra. But when I said Cleopatra, you went, oh, the Egyptian pharaoh, the woman. Cleopatra, by the way, it's the 7th. I'm keeping track. I know y'all mostly aren't. Cleopatra the 7th is the famous one. Cleopatra the 7th, that you identify as Egyptian, was 0% Egyptian. So her family tree is wonky and difficult because on 2 occasions she had an uncle marry a niece. So I don't know how to do this because I can't count the generations back, because what am I supposed to do with the niece-uncle thing? Twice. So there's 2 ways to count it, right? You count 7 generations because you count the niece as a separate generation, or 5 generations and you make your life not a nightmare. So I'm doing 5. If you go back 5 generations, the way to do this, the math on this, the math is fun, and the really cool thing is just about everything in the universe can be described as by math, right? You take 2 to the power of the generation you're trying to go to. So you're 0 generations away from you, 2 to the 0 power is 1. Your parents are 1 generation away from you, 2 to the 1st power is 2. Your grandparents are 2 away from you, so 2 squared is 4. Your great-grandparents are 2 cubed, that's 8. By the time you go 5 generations back, so 3 greats and then grandparents, you end up with 32 ancestors. You should have 32 great-great-great-grandparents. She had 4. A Persian and 3 Greeks. It's actually worse if you go 1 generation forward, you go to the 4th generation, she only had 2. And then when she got to the 2, that 2 had 3 kids. One of the kids married his niece. His niece was the product of his brother and sister. So I don't even know where to go other than, oh my God! But notice what we do. We go Cleopatra the Egyptian, Heron the Greek. Heron was definitely very Egyptian by the time we got to the 1st century AD. Cleopatra was definitely very not Egyptian at all in any way, shape, or form, because she had been so secluded from Egyptian culture, because the Greeks looked down on the Egyptians so intensely that they went out of their way to inbreed to try to prevent Egyptian DNA from entering the royal family. It's intense. Okay, let me give you another example of what I mean by this. The guy who invented philosophy. Some people call him Thales. Americans usually say Thales. So I'm just going to say Thales to make our lives easy. Thales, the Greek philosopher who invented philosophy, wasn't Greek. He wasn't Greek. Isn't that cool? The guy who invented Greek philosophy wasn't Greek. He lived in a Greek city. The city was called Miletos. Miletos is today in Turkey. He spoke Greek, but he also spoke Phoenician because his family was from Lebanon. They were Phoenicians. They had moved to Miletos for business purposes. He grew up in Miletos and then produced the world's first ever work of philosophy, a book titled Water is Best. A Phoenician invented philosophy in a Greek city in what is today Turkey. But when we think of Thales, we think of a Greek. When we think of Heron, we think of a Greek. When we think of Cleopatra, we think of an Egyptian. That's what I mean. What we do is we have this tendency to be selective with how we apply the identities. And that gets all sorts of messy. Okay, so now let's